A while back, I forgot who it was, but I think someone brought up Slay the Princess. I think at least it was Slay the Princess, but anyways, it's kind of like an EVN. Kind of depends on the semantics of it. For me, it's like, yeah, it is. I was worried about it for a different video, but the amount I wrote about it was like a lot, and it just eclipses the rest, and I felt bad. So I'm just making this its own thing. Anyways, it's an EVN, but it's more like in the choose your adventure category. I'm not sure if these kind of books still exist. It was kind of a product of its time considering you could just make it into a game now. So it's like, I guess most people don't even care about it. The closest example I can give of Slay of the Princess is like a mix of witty conversation of like the Stanley Parable thing and like the vibes of Baroque. And that's probably an awful example because I don't think a lot of people know what Baroque even is. But for those who do and for those who like it, it's like, holy shit, that's rad, I'm gonna buy it. It's like $17. I think it was first released on the Saturn and it got ported over to like the PS1 and then there was a remake for the PS2 and I think it's on the Wii now, I don't know. The vibe was like constantly ominous. I only played the PS2 version and apparently the feel of the game in the Saturn was even better than it. It's probably some hardware limitation that became like a bonus like Silent Hill 1. But anyways, what was going on in Broke and what you the player were like, oh, what are you doing and how it all connected, it was all fucking vague. And a good chunk of the fun was trying to figure it all out. And that's pretty much what Slay the Princess is half the time. I'm skipping the ones that would be considered like spoilers, but it kind of starts the same. You start with knowing nothing, somebody talks to you, tells you what to do, and gives you the means to do it. Due to the nature of the scenery, it's like, oh, what the fuck's happening? So you already don't trust them at all, but it's not like you have anybody else to talk to and there's no more ideas happening. You're like, hey, he's the nicest guy I know right now, so yeah, fuck it, I'll do it. So you go with it for now, and just instead of using the angelic rifle to shoot the absolute god to salvage the world, you just use the knife to slay the princess that would destroy the world. Kind of similar. There's more similarities going on, especially later on, but it doesn't really matter. Maybe I'll talk about it in the spoilers, but it feels like all I'm going to be talking about is Broke then, so probably not. The largest difference between them is you actually have someone to talk to and to like bounce ideas off this time around. He's the narrator, and that's where Stanley Parable comes in. The dialogue is witty, it's charming, and for a decent while, the star of the title. Hell, for some people, it remains the star of the show like the whole way through. The VN isn't linear, there's like around 10 paths you can take, and I think you have to take 5. And technically there's like 11 paths, I think. And each path has like multiple endings and generally have like an extra continuation of the plot depending on your choices. And depending on your choices, you eventually get more voices in your head and a la like Disco Elysium. They kind of vary, some are great, some are kind of boring. There's one you always get because he's the one that you start out with. A good chunk of the VN's enjoyment comes from the experimenting around. But my favorite ones are the Simp, the Contrarian, and the Opportunist. Though I guess there's 2 simps and the best part probably comes from when like the paranoid shows up. And there's a couple of others and there's some in there that I still like, but these were my favorites. Also, maybe the definition of it is old, but the contrarian is kind of weird one because while he is one, he's more of a clown or like a troll. He goes against what the narrator wants, but only for like shits and giggles. It's not like, oh, I'm actually against what you want. It's like, hey, does it piss you off? Yeah, alright, I'm gonna do that. So while it's kind of a horror game, it's the type that makes you think. It's more of a cosmic horror type thing. There's a lot of shit going on, but you don't know any of it. The narrator won't tell you anything. He's like your only source of information, and he dictates what's around and the actions. You just can't decide your actions, but once you made, you can't stop. So basically it's like, oh, it's not the shit your pants in 1 second type of thing. It's pretty tame and you probably scare yourself from all the warnings and what's actually in the title. Honestly, the levity that the voices bring kind of stop any dread from happening, except for one branch, and fair enough, it's called Nightmare, so it makes sense. Even then, it's not all that bad. You basically still have all the controls, so nothing really kicks in. I did the first run blind, and honestly, I think I really lucked out on what I got because they were like my favorite routes so far anyways. Technically, each path would grant you a couple of different lines each in the finale, but I didn't go that far because I think each path I picked, it's like, alright, let me pick this one. And I had one that was common, and it's like, oh, it's a separate delineation, but overall it's like kind of the same, so it's like I'm not doing this for like 8 more times. So I did 2 full runs, and then like a lot of where I reset after clearing one path, and it's like, okay, I get where this is going, so alright, fine. I went through Razor, Damsel, Spectre, Witch, and I think I ended with Nightmare. I didn't check around, but probably like Nightmare and the Witch are probably like the 2 more like liked ones. Beast, Adversary, and Tower are all kind of interesting, but it didn't really hit the same highs as Witch or Nightmare. Beast actually hints at a few things on what's happening, and all of the routes hint on what the princess actually is, and technically knowing that you can also infer like what the main character represents too. There's a couple endings depending on your choices. For the finale, it feels like most of the dialogue options aren't really necessary at all, and it's more of like an extra flavor type of thing. There's also a couple dialogue trees before this that you can't really finish in one run, so you either have to save scum it or do like another run and explains like like what's happening here, what are you, what am I, what is this princess lady, and it all works, but it's basically giving you like a time limit. And then there's like a confrontation of ideals, and it's all good fun, but it'd be nice if there was like a fail state here and there, and then you could just fuck up. But it's like, no, it's like overall you can always get the good ending, or you can always get the ending that you want. I'll talk about more in the spoilers as well. Overall, it's well written and has a lot of charm to it. It'd be a lot less effective if the narrator and the voices around didn't have any audio at all. I've talked about this before, but it's one of those things where I'd rather have been cut off like a whole route to get the budget for the main character to talk. Anyways, the routes are fun. The princesses have like one voice actress that changes her tone depending on which branch you're on. It really works well. It's just I find the narrator is more compelling, but it's also more that I enjoy these archetypes more often anyway, so it's like, it makes sense for me. It takes maybe around 7 hours to finish all the paths, maybe around 9 to 10 if you want to hit like each path's lines in the finale. If you're like super into it, I'm just not. It's like, alright, it's fine, I had a good experience for it. Your first rotation is compelling enough and you can finish it in one sitting, and that's kind of great considering my ass gets distracted all the time. There's a couple of other things, but I'll go through that in spoilers. I'd give this around like a 9 in terms of like tone and writing, but more like an 8 in terms of what I'm looking for. It's not a title for its plot, but it's a title about its ideas. And it's cool, but it's also not something I'd probably remember in a year. The easiest way I can explain it's like, oh, this was more like an experience than like a traditional A to B plot. Hey, here's the beginning, it goes in and it ends, right? No, it's like, it was fine, it was fun, it's refreshing, but I'm not going to stay here. Compared to like being a metal fan and then you listen to like Nanowar of Steel, it's like, oh, they have all these like joke tracks, like Norwegian reggaeton, and it just hits different, it's funny, it's refreshing, you remember it, but you'll go back to Iron Maiden tomorrow. I think they are doing like a large update eventually, and I'll probably pick it back up when they do. Maybe they'll expand upon a little bit here and there and give some more love to some of these paths where it felt like it kind of ended abruptly. And the funny thing is where you get to it, or when you get to the end and you understand things, all of those abrupt endings actually make sense in context. It's one of those weird things where it's a fine line between adding enough to be like interesting and not adding too much where it just like fucks up the whole experience. Like, I think Mamiya's like that, where I still didn't get to it again because I finished like 2 extra routes of the new ones. Like, a lot of this new changes I did not like. So this is a future edit. The devs forked part of what was going to be like part of the pristine edition, and it's mainly additions to the finale, and they're all rather cool. There's transitions for each of the paths you took, and there's like a decent chunk of more dialogue of what's happening. It still feels like it's 2 walls just talking to each other. Basically, the amalgamations of the paths you take don't really seem to change their tone towards like the protag. When it's a specific character during the interims, then you can actually see your choices take into effect. Some are angry at you, some forgive you, and some are actually just happy to talk to you, but as a whole, it's still the same conversation with the main body. As an example, I did like a full run of me choosing all the paths of being a total asshole, and another one where I was trying to be a good person overall, and it's like, nothing really changed, which is weird because if you pick one good and one bad by the end of like the second, not run, but the second path, there's like a conversation of like, oh, there's contradictions between them, and it's like, oh, if you're going full aggro, then there's a conversation of why she's like, oh, why aren't you super pissed at me, and I don't want to keep on doing this and crap like that. It's like, so they know like, oh, there is differences between what you do, but for the finale, there's not much, which is weird. There's also more dialogue options during like the last phase where you have your last chat with the princess. The scene was already great, so it didn't improve it that much, but it was still really nice to have. Though I guess I'm wondering if the extra changes like changed if you went all full aggro or like full good guy run as well. So I don't know, I'm not gonna do it again. But, like, maybe there's a larger contrast than before. Because from what I remember, like every time I got to the finale, it was more of a, hey, we're both pretty toxic, weren't we? It's like, oh yeah, that was a weird time. And that's basically it for the future edit. So now I'm in the spoilers, and most of this is just talking about some of the paths and some of the endings, and it gets to the 2 main characters. The voice of the hero is always with you because that's like the first character in your first route. It's funny that he shows up if you decide to troll instead, and now you have like the hero and the contrarian with you in there. This is actually a condition for a set of like different endings because everything is getting fragmented, and now you have like a match of 3 like princesses in one. I think is it called a stranger? The princess and the main character are like technically gods here. They were technically one being split into 2. The narrator is the one that artificially made him from like her parts or whatever. So it's like a man-made god type thing. The princess is like, I think it's called the shifting mound, which just means change. It's fancy for change. Whilst the protag is the long quiet, which is again just fancy for like permanence, right? Technically, you could say he indirectly has the power of perception. From what I can tell, it's just the princess changing to what he perceives things as. It's the reason why she changes her forms depending on your actions. So if you go in without a knife thinking she's not a threat, then overall she's not a threat. But if you think she might have a hidden knife, then out of nowhere she has a knife. Or if you shit your pants and run back up the stairs and like lock the rooms and shit, she becomes the nightmare. Everything actually makes sense. So let's say she randomly blows up while like the main protagonist is asleep, then goes like, oh yeah, this tree's a dragon. It probably just stays as a tree. But if she's awake as a cave, the tree might turn into a dragon, right? And that's pretty much the reason why the narrator doesn't give you any info. All the info will just influence on what you think, and then that changes how you perceive things, and that fucks everything up. So if really he wanted her dead from the beginning, he could just like, hey, you woke up, oh, the princess is dead. And it's like, oh shit, really? Like, yep, princess dead. And then she just be dead. And the story be over, then you have no experience, so like that's what's happening. Technically, if you avoid the cabin, she eventually comes to you and tells you like, hey, this is what you have to do. But if he initially perceives her as dead, then maybe that wouldn't happen anyway, but, you know, not part of the plot. Either way, it's why the adversary version doesn't die, because Stubborn thinks she can't die, and then because she revives Stubborn thinks like, hey, if she can't die, then I can't die either, and it's an endless fight because that's what we want. And to the dismay of the narrator, the protag does revive and keeps on duking it out. I don't think that protag can change, his physicality can only be reverted back to like its origin. So he can't be a beast like the princess. But, you know, if in a different way you're thinking, it's like, oh, if the Stubborn dies, and out of nowhere it's like, oh, actually, I can beat her ass all the time, then her as the beast would go back into a normal person, I think. So again, the narrator doesn't say shit because he knows anything he says will happen. So if the protag would only get like the cold persona where he's like, oh, she's weak, she's pathetic, I can kill her whenever, he'd always win. The two main characters are always like gravitating towards each other because they used to be like the one being, and that's kind of what the beast path is about, and it'll be your best bet to understand what's happening before shit hits the fan and you're like, oh, now I know what, you know, you're in the finale, you understand what's happening. But it's generally like a very toxic environment because the natures are like, oh, we're one thing, but also we're opposite because I took what wasn't there and now it's not, so I'm always permanence, I'm stasis, I'm always the same and you're always changing. It's not always the case, but it is for the majority, like 95% of the time, and it's pretty rare for them to have like a mutual understanding until like the end of their path, or like the finale. The finale is kind of weird because there's this whole like debate section where she summons all of her vessels and that you went through collecting to explain like their line of thinking. The vessels are basically just the princesses that you perceived. Anyways, whatever you say doesn't really matter outside of like, okay, you're right, let's go. And then you get this one ending. Otherwise, it just keeps on going because both of you just fucking stubborn gods and not agreeing to each other. And it kind of makes more sense with the prototype because he's like, oh, he's permanent. He's not going to change his mind. But I think the idea is now is like, oh, she's fully realized, she understands herself, and now he can't just change his perception, she changes as well. It's like, no, you can do it for the vessel, so you can't do it for me. But also it can just be like, oh, he's in awe of this being and he just can't revert it, so he's basically fucked. And that's again why the narrative doesn't say shit. By the end, the voice of the hero comes back and he pushes you back to where like it all began, and this time you can meet the princess that has like a sense of self this time around. It's different depending if you did the stranger section or not, so she either has like 3 faces or one. It's basically the same amalgamation of like, I think the prisoner, witch, and damsel, but I'm probably wrong. And this one ending's really sweet with the 3 faces because if you choose to leave with her, I think it's the prisoner who's never smiling, she always has like a frown on her face that she smiles, so like, oh, that's nice. Anyways, there's just 3 endings you can get in there. One where you kill her and the change is gone, no one can die anymore and the world is just being stagnant. Then there's the one where they choose to start from the beginning again, knowing that the chances of doing the same exact things are pretty high, but like, yeah, let's do it anyway, let's see what happens. Then there's the one where the protagonist is tired, he doesn't want to be a god anymore, he just wants to leave the fucking cabin with her. It's like, hey, let's just be normal people. And at this point, the huge shifting mound that was outside the cabin all the time is no longer there. The perception that she's anything out of the ordinary is gone, so she's like a normal person. So I was like, oh, you getting more powers. So now it's like, yeah, she's afraid, she doesn't know what's outside there. What are we going to figure out after we leave this cabin? So because of the basis of what she actually was, even at that original point, I think the world was already fucking dead anyway. There's only 2 of them. Because, you know, change basically consists of everything. So was the narrator really lying? Not really. He was just playing along with his worlds to help out his own cause. The cabin just contains her influence, so if you do nothing, the house can eventually decay and then her influence is back in effect. This actually happened in one of the prisoner paths where he also gets trapped in there because he's just retarded. And then I know where they're both just stuck there waiting forever until the house just erodes down and then the vessel happens, right? Because it's just doing something very basic like increasing the temperature a degree every minute. We're pretty much dead pretty fast. And even without the extremes, death is just a natural thing, and it could be that the world is already in the brink of annihilation anyway. So she's just like nudged the ball into the goal. It doesn't really matter what happens. So it doesn't really matter what kind of ending you get. It's like, okay, if you pick the one where everybody, where her and he leaves, like, oh, it's great, we're no longer gods. If you're the ones like, actually, we're gods, we're gonna, join together or just be together and go somewhere else. Like, all right, cool. This world dies, a new one gets created, it dies again, a new one gets created. It's how it is. It's nothing like super scary about it. It's more of a personal fear than anything else. Like, oh, your world is gonna die, your history, your ideas, everything will die, and then a new one will happen, and you have no idea what's gonna happen there. We just don't know.